There is a major development in the January 6th investigation that's literally happening right now. The White House lawyer who warned Trump of every crime imaginable is going under oath for the first time today. In essence, this is what losing looks like. Trump White House counsel Pat Cipollone testifying under oath. And when you talk about people losing standoffs at the January 6th committee, there is another sign of another major Trump White House figure who then was out planning and plotting about January 6th independently. Steve Bannon, the Washington Post, crossing a story moments ago that as soon as tomorrow, Mr. Bannon may actually fold and find some accommodational route to testify. He's going to cite potentially a letter from Donald Trump, according to brand new Washington Post reporting. And as you may recall, he is awaiting a federal criminal trial that could land him in prison. So it is a big deal that Mr. Bannon now is eyeing, according to the Post, some sort of accommodation. We're going to get to that story in a few moments. As I mentioned, we're tracking more than one development. As for the White House lawyer, Mr. Cipollone, well, he went hours and hours, 8.5 hours total. In fact, we're told that it just wrapped up within the last few moments here. Cipollone arrived before 8:30 a.m. He's actually visible in a passenger seat caught by cameras there. He was escorted to a conference room to provide this testimony. There were some shouted questions from the reporters today. This was a dramatic scene when you consider just how long this was in the making. He did not, though, in those hallway shots, respond to the press. Mr. Cipollone matters because he is someone who's been quoted more than most as a witness and someone warning Trump aides and the president himself about possible crimes. There were discussions about seizing voting machines and sending fraudulent letters to state officials. He was also in the West Wing on that fateful day of the 6th. Punchbowl reporting the Select Committee does not have an agreement with Cipollone about what can be asked, meaning what is on or off the table in his mind. And prior to the Cassidy Hutchinson testimony that made so many waves, the panel did, Mullen on the record, interview, then Cipollone backed away from that. He was, to put it simply, in the room when it all happened. He was in the room giving the explicit warnings according to more than one aide. And as we reported last night, he was in the room in a way that made his criminal warnings so memorable that so many people either wrote them down or remembered them and told the committee about them. As for whether or not some of that is technically hearsay, well, as of today, anything anyone else said Cipollone said is no longer technically hearsay at all because he spent 8 hours explaining himself. Take the January 3rd meeting in the Oval Office, which we don't know what they asked about, but we would certainly expect it was on the list. That was when Trump was talked out of trying to illegally get the DOJ to break laws to help him steal the election.
And so the story is not going to be that the Department of Justice has found massive corruption that would have changed the result of the election. It's going to be the disaster of Jeff Clark. And I think at that point, Pat Cipollone said, yeah, this is a murder-suicide pact, this letter.
And I would note, too, Congressman, that it was in this part of the conversation where Steve pointed out that Jeff Clark would be left leading a graveyard, and that comment clearly had an impact on the president. The leadership will be gone. Jeff Clark will be left leading a graveyard.
Jeff Clark is the individual who saw his home searched. We have more on that tonight as well. As I said, there's a lot happening. If you get the feeling that the probe is escalating, the legal developments are intensifying, it's because they are. The other point, though, that I want to make sure we're very clear on here before I bring in our expert is, you heard those senior ranking officials under oath citing people, graveyard. And the idea that basically, if you go forward with these plans, well, you'll be committing new crimes, and you won't be in office much longer, Mr. President. That's the kind of thing that was cited to Cipollone. Today, again, you don't take 8 hours to simply say no comment or plead the fifth. We have circumstantial indications today that this was a substantive set of answers. And that means Cipollone would also be able to address and perhaps refine or fact-check any of the many references to him and his testimony in the hearings thus far.
Mr. Cipollone and I had a brief private conversation where he said to me, we need to make sure that this doesn't happen. This would be legally a terrible idea for us.
Pat Cipollone weighed in at one point, I remember saying, you know, that letter that this guy wants to send, that letter is a murder-suicide pact.
Mr. Cipollone said something to the effect of, please make sure we don't go up to the Capitol, Cassidy. Keep in touch with me. we're going to get charged with every crime imaginable. Pat was concerned it would look like we were obstructing justice or obstructing the Electoral College count.
Ms. Hutchinson there citing at least 2 felonies that Cipollone warned about. So again, in these 8 hours today, these are things that we would expect he'd be asked about. NBC News has a source who says that he has been, quote, a cooperative witness within the parameters of his desire to protect executive privilege in the office of the counsel. And then there is a real distinction here, because executive privilege does exist for people who are not trying to commit crimes, who are not trying to do misconduct or steal the election, who are providing privileged counsel or other privileged professional work for the executive branch, for the president in this case. So unlike, say, Mr. Bannon, who I mentioned also is talking about privilege today, and we'll get to that, or Mr. Navarro, the White House counsel does have some strong privilege claims. But they are not like attorney-client privilege. Indeed, there is no person that they have as attorney-client protection for. They're not the personal lawyer for the president. You pay Mr. Cipollone's salary when he serves, and he serves for the office of the presidency. Now, here's how one former January 6th panel investigator put some of this.
I think Mr. Cipollone, for some of the information he has legitimate privilege concerns, but a lot of the information he has is clearly not privileged. So hypothetically, if he said, Mr. President, you should not go to the Capitol because here are the reasons why it would be illegal, I think that might be privileged. But him just saying to another staffer that he thinks it might violate every law imaginable, I don't think that that itself is privileged. The comments that Mr. Cipollone may have made to somebody like Cassidy Hutchinson probably are not privileged.
Probably not privileged, and that's super important. If you warn, as we heard in this bombshell testimony, about every law or every crime imaginable being violated, well, that could come out today.
Mr. Cipollone said something to the effect of, please make sure we don't go up to the Capitol, Cassidy. Keep in touch with me. We're going to get charged with every crime imaginable.
Today is when that will be lined up, and Mr. Cipollone can say what he meant. And was it rhetoric? Was he exaggerating? Or was he literally concerned that a whole series of felonies were going to be committed? He grasped what the plot was. The top White House lawyer saw the core project and figured out it was a criminal project. His job is to develop every possible argument and defense for executive power, but not to commit crimes. So when you look at the obstruction or the fraud, well, that's a big deal. Now, what did he mean when he said every crime imaginable? Well, that's one of the key questions. Then you have this reference to the Murder-Suicide Pact. This matters a lot, and in plain English, it matters about whether people who actually worked for Trump at the DOJ or Trump himself will go to jail. What they meant by murder-suicide was legally, not that there would be a murder, although, of course, there was violence, but that legally it would be the Justice Department's murder-suicide to have it in writing, on record, trying to break laws to steal the election. Then number 3, you have conversations with then Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. Hutchinson talked about how those two were discussing some serious stuff on the 6th.
No more than a minute and a half later, I see Pat Cipollone barreling down the hallway towards our office. I remember Pat saying to him something to the effect of, the rioters have gotten to the Capitol, Mark. We need to go down and see the president now. And Mark looked up at him and said, he doesn't want to do anything, Pat. And Pat said something to the effect of, and very clearly had said this to Mark, something to the effect of, Mark, something needs to be done or people are going to die.
Do something or people will die. And on the 6th, you had Cipollone in the West Wing pleading with Meadows about all of that. Take a listen.
Jared, are you aware of instances where Pat Cipollone threatened to resign?
I kind of, like I said, my interest at that time was on trying to get as many pardons done. And I know that, he was always, him and the team were always saying, oh, we're going to resign. We're not going to be here if this happens, if that happens. So I kind of took it up to just be whining, to be honest with you.
That's Mr. Kushner, who was, well, earlier in line willing to testify. You see him on video, but you see him basically casting Mr. Cipollone as a whiner. And when he said that, of course, Mr. Cipollone had not come out and testified under oath before the video camera. So it's kind of interesting. That could blow up in Mr. Kushner's face if Mr. Cipollone has a different view, if he thinks his efforts to prevent a criminal conspiracy, a coup, and a violent insurrection were not whining, but were rather him putting his neck on the line, threatening to resign to try to stop those potential crimes. As for the reference to pardons, well, let me be clear. Even Donald Trump, who loves to break rules and do things his own way, can't just snap his fingers to create a pardon. If you want it to stand up in court, you do need lawyers involved. The White House counsel is one of the people who would know who was asking for pardons, how far did the process get, and did Donald Trump, again, to the question of jail, did he explore whether he needed a pardon for himself as an admission of guilt because he thought he'd already done stuff that could land him in prison?